How we present data can affect how people read it and the conclusions that they draw. Today, we're going to talk about how we can create data visualizations that promote equity and some common mistakes that we might be making that might even perpetuate inequality.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Coffee Time with Masterminds. My name is Peter Blakely, and I'm the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I am Cynthia Rojas, founder and principal of To Your Growth.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I'm Rebecca Tuttle, founder and principal of Grant Right Now and Grant Writing for Good.
Welcome to Coffee Time. And if you're joining us, please let us know your name and where you're joining us from in the chat. My name is Peter Blakely. I am going to be joined today by my friend Eli Holder. Eli is the founder of 3IAP, a data viz design firm that helps clients design and develop psychologically effective data visualizations and custom data products. He's a former business founder and product leader and holds his Bachelor of Science in Computer Science from UNC Chapel Hill. Eli, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely.
So Eli, you specialize in making data visualizations that are based on how people think and feel about data, right? And we started an interesting conversation a little while ago. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
I had written a piece on data visualization and targeted universalism. And targeted universalism is a way about thinking about promoting equity. And you came across that piece and thought, this is really interesting. Say why.
Interesting is one way to put it. I honestly, I found it like alarming at first because the chart that you pointed out on your blog post was exactly how I would have designed something. And so it was a little shocking to see like, oh, I hadn't considered ways that this could be kind of misinterpreted.
Yeah.
And so it was eye-opening because it was an approach that feels common, I think, to a lot of people that do data viz, and to see that there were implications to it that you wouldn't otherwise.
And it was very common. I mean, it was and I'll show it later. It was a standard way to show this educational data. So we started a conversation about like, how could we do this better? Partly because you were implementing some changes and you were getting some interesting pushback from clients. Say a little bit about that.
Yeah. So last summer, had two different projects at once that were related to racial equity, and we're looking specifically at different outcomes across race. So getting into that, wanted to make sure that we were doing it right, that we were doing it in a way that isn't harmful. So did a bunch of research and came across your post that way. And when it came up in the projects, I brought it up to the two different clients. One client was like, I can definitely see it. And they were into it right away. The other client I was surprised by because they work more closely in this space. They're a nonprofit. Their mission is related to equity, and they push back. And their pushback was based on, I think, not unreasonable principles. Their pushback was based on if we tell the story and if we show this data in a way that I guess we would call it deficit framed. If we show it in this way, it's a simpler story. It's tighter. It's more compact. It's a better soundbite. Therefore, we will get kind of more reach out of it.
Yeah.
Which is like at the time, like I was kind of stumped, and that's when I reached out to you. Like, how do you think about the trade-off there? And I think that's what got our conversation started. But since then,
and that was very interesting for me because I had, I'd sort of written that blog post and left it there. And so getting that feedback was really, really helpful. And I remember the moment in our conversation where I was like, well, yeah, that would work if we if we were all on the same page about how structural racism works. But right, but I don't think you can assume everybody is on that same page. Yeah.
I remember seeing that and thinking, yeah, like that's a pretty big if, like
right.
the odds of everybody kind of being on the same page.
Yeah.
And if your goal is to kind of create awareness, then by definition, a lot of the audience isn't on that page yet.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's get a little bit more concrete, and let's look at like the initial that initial chart.
Yeah.
That I was talking about. So here, some people listen and don't watch, so I'm going to describe it a little bit. So here is that initial chart, which is, I think, how most of us would present this data. The example is some academic data. There are 4 different race ethnic groups on the chart. There's 5 different points in time along the bottom axis, and different groups are performing differently over time. And as it happens in this chart, Asian and white students are at the top of the chart, and then African American and Hispanic Latino are a little bit lower down. And this is what everybody, right? This is how everybody would present this data, right? And let's talk about like why I thought this was deficit framed. Was how I read this is, oh, the African American students are not doing as well as the white students, right? And that's not the issue, right? The issue is the African American students are not doing as well as the African American students can do, right? Or as the target that we have for all students, which is not just what white people do, right?
Right.
Yeah. So my initial proposal was like, let's just break them apart. So in option 2, I've got like 4 small charts. So each race ethnic group is on its own chart next to a target, which is just a target for all students, right? Yep. And that was the initial proposal, because it helped me think about like each of these groups and how they can not just do as well as, right, this like centered white group, but how they can just do well, right? Yeah. Now since then, you've taken this idea a lot further. Yeah.
So the small multiples format that you have here, I think the initial problem that you're talking about was the centering problem of if you compare to the majority group, then your kind of goal line is only the average of the majority group, which isn't as high as it could be for the non-majority groups. It's also not as high as it could be for the majority groups.
Yes, exactly.
And so splitting it up into small multiples lets you kind of compare each group to a more, I guess, universal goal line. And so it accomplishes it's a way of solving the centering problem. But there's actually another problem that comes out of the deficit framing. Can we go back to the first one?
The first one, yeah.
And so the other problem that kind of comes out of this is a problem of blaming. And so there's a bunch of steps to this, but when people see a chart like this, you don't just a lot of people don't just conclude that like Asian and people in Asian and white groups do X% better on these tests than African American Black groups or Hispanic or Latino groups. A conclusion that a lot of people draw is actually like Asian people do better on these tests because they're smarter. Black people do worse on these tests because they don't value education, which is obviously false. But when people see a chart like this, that's still a conclusion that a lot of people can take away from this.
Yeah.
And so there are kind of multiple problems to, and we can talk about like where that comes from, like what the source of that problem is. But there are kind of multiple ways that a chart like this, as intuitive as it may seem, can actually paint a pretty like a picture that the designer obviously doesn't intend to paint.
No, right, and it's not that the designer is painting that picture. It's that So you've received that messaging, right? Every reader has received that messaging so many thousands of times that just by not saying something different, you create this base for that to get reinforced.
Yeah, and I think this is something that's true of like it's part of what separates, like if we were plotting like bake sale items, like what sold better, like cookies or brownies or something like that. Like that's one thing. Like you can plot that however you want, because cookies and brownies don't care.
Right. We don't hold stories about those. Yeah.
Right. Like they don't. There's no backstory on that. But like when you're showing data about people, we bring, as viewers, we bring a lot more baggage. Yeah. And specifically when you're plotting different racial groups, like there's a whole history of obviously racism in the United States, and there's also just general kind of like social biases that we hold towards people, and specifically towards people who are in other groups than we are. And so when you're designing data viz that involves people, it's another set of kind of considerations that you need to kind of keep in mind and try to solve for.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about some of the work that you've done, right, since then. That's expanding on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to open up the?
Sure. Because you've really taken this idea and gone a lot further.
Yeah. So I was interested in the blaming part of the problem that we mentioned before, and trying to figure out, like, so after seeing your post, like I wouldn't have connected the dots myself, but like once I kind of saw that, like it made kind of intuitive sense. And there's also a fair amount of there's other research out there that kind of backs it up indirectly, to show that like people could see a chart like this and kind of assume and that it could kind of reinforce stereotypes. And so like one version of that is that like with this bias called like correspondence bias, it's or the fundamental attribution error. It's this concept of like when you see that somebody has experienced an outcome, you in the back of your mind you try to explain why. And so like the classical experiment of this is that they'll show participants a story about like somebody has won a contest that is like either random or like completely skewed in their favor. And then they say like, well, why did Jim win? And people will say, Jim won because he's smart. Jim won because he's a hard worker. Or not even direct, like not even directly like that. They'll just kind of Jim won, therefore in their mind somehow Jim is smarter than the other contestants or smart and deserving of it. And then there's kind of a negative version of it, which is like if there's a bad outcome, we tend to blame people personally rather than kind of like look to environmental causes. So like if somebody shows up late, in the back of our minds, it's they were snoozing. They pressed the alarm clock too many times, rather than like the train wasn't working. Rather than like they had an emergency with their kids. There's a tendency to jump to kind of like to personal blame, and both of these are correspondence biases, attribution biases. And so what kind of clicked to me when I saw this was that this is showing different outcomes with no other explanations. And so like it's just it invites you to do these kind of these false personal attributions. And so, like I said, there's several different studies that kind of show this like indirectly. But I wanted to kind of test it out and see and try to give it some more direct evidence. And so set up some experiments looking at basically comparing two different charts. So this one on the left would be a deficit frame chart. It's got a lot of the same properties as the original one that we talked about. The main one being that it's comparing one average to another average.
Let's describe it a little bit for people who aren't looking at the screen right now.
Yeah.
So this is another horizontal bar chart. I confess I love horizontal bar charts and I use them for everything. But It's nicely laid out. We've got 4 race ethnic categories. And then we have average wages. And this is exactly how I would have presented this data. So we're comparing 4 averages, and they're between 17-ish and 10-ish dollars. The category labeled Asian has the highest average. The category labeled Hispanic has the lowest, right?
Yep.
This is exactly how we were all taught to present this data.
And it's not factually inaccurate by any means.
Yep.
Actually, I should say that like this is made to look realistic, but this is not from any real study. This is all hypothetical data, just to be clear. But the where this goes wrong is the emphasis of the average. So part of like one of the kind of foundations of any stereotype is this assumption that like everybody in one group is the same. It assumes homogeneity of a group of people. And the kind of like the number version of that is assuming that outcomes have low variance. And so when people look at a chart like this, the assumption isn't just that like Asian people earn $7 an hour more than Hispanic people. The assumption from this is that like all Asian people earn $7 an hour more than all Hispanic people.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you think about like, that rule of ink to information, right? Mm-hmm. This violates the rules so thoroughly. There is a whole lot of ink doing nothing but implying that everybody earns $17, right? That there are a whole lot of people earning $17 an hour. And equal numbers of people, right? All those lines are the same thickness. So it makes it seem like these groups are equally weighted and beefy with this really specific end point where the average is. And that's actually totally not how averages work. Right.
And you can know that going into it, like you can know how averages work, but still like in some part of our brain reads this as like, yeah, of course, maybe it's a little bit scattered around the endpoint, but like most people don't recognize like how scattered it.
No, right. And statisticians might say, well, that's why you include the standard error or like some other indicator of scatteredness. In your chart, but realistically, who does that? It just confuses the audience.
It's a problem that like uncertainty is very rarely shown, and when it is, it's usually shown as, and we can talk about this in a second, but it's usually shown as a confidence interval, which is misleading. It's in a whole other way.
Nobody's really sure what that means anyway.
Exactly. This is 100% true. And so the what this kind of implies is kind of low variance in outcomes between the different groups. Mm-hmm. And that on its own is maybe not necessarily bad. Like it's just like an inaccurate kind of read of it. But that combined with kind of this other baggage that we have about other people and kind of these personal attribution errors, it ends up being not just that like you misread the chart, but you misread the chart and you assign blame to it. So this becomes not only like does Group A earn more than Group C, it's Group A earns more than Group C because they work harder. And so that's the hiding the variance is kind of the core problem here, because it implies homogeneity within the groups, and that sets us up to kind of let these other personal biases kind of take over. And so like a way to show this data that doesn't have that, or that kind of goes against that, would be a jitter chart shows the individual outcomes for everybody that was involved in this hypothetical study. Mm-hmm. Every dot is one person. If you want to describe this.
No, go ahead.
So this is showing the exact same data as the bar chart before. We've got these big vertical lines that show the average. This corresponds to the endpoint of kind of each line. And so this still conveys everything that you see in the first chart, with kind of the group averages. But at the same time, you have the dots scattered around their individual outcomes. And so you can see the full range of possible outcomes. And instead of seeing seeing a story that kind of implies that like everybody in group A has better outcomes than everybody in group C, you can see that there's a whole lot of overlap. And being able to see that overlap is the thing that breaks that sense of false homogeneity. And so the idea was that like if deficit framing is a problem, and if it's caused by kind of this not being able to see the variance within each group, then we should see a difference between these two. Actually, so we should see with either of them, we should see some amount of personal attribution when you ask people like, how do you explain this chart? That would show that the problem exists in the first place. And then if we see a difference between something on like the chart on the left and the chart on the right, then that would imply that it's something related to the visualization itself. And so tested this, ran an experiment to test kind of one chart against the other. The idea is you show this chart and then you ask people kind of how do you interpret it? Like what are some of the reasons for why this might be? And keep in mind that there's nothing about these two charts that gives any reason. Like it doesn't explain why this is the case at all. However, most people, a slim majority of people would read this. I think about like 53% would read this and say that at least part of the reason is that one group works harder than the other, or one group is smarter than the other. And so a small majority of people will read this and agree with some personal attribution of it. And so that happens kind of in both cases. Like if you average the two groups together, the two experiment groups together, that's a problem in general. However, what we also found was that the design of the chart actually does affect it. And so the bar chart on the left, on a scale of like 0 to 100, the bar chart on the left has like 7 points higher of kind of personal attribution, and therefore kind of this tendency to blame than the chart on the right. And so the way that you design it can marginally improve the interpretations that people have when they look at data like this.
But I think that the chart on the right, the one you call the jitter chart, jitter plot has so much more information in it, right? I mean, we can see that there are more dots, right, in one category than another, right? Like one of these groups is better represented. We can see how spread out the dots are. It really makes me realize that there are a lot of different experiences going into this average, right? Yep,
exactly.
And I think that helps me think like, oh, these are real people having different experiences.
Yep. Yeah. And so it addresses one of the other problems that we talked about as well. When you look at an average, you don't see the different kind of subgroups in it. And this is fake data, and so it doesn't show it very well. But for realistic data, you could expect to see like different clusters of the different dots, and that comes across here to show that like even within a group there are different subgroups that would have their own averages if you were to kind of break them out. And so that's another reason to try to show it. But
that's a really interesting point. Going back to that initial chart and the race ethnic group, I have heard, and I think this is so important, that when you get to a category like Asian American, that is not a very good, useful category, right? And that there are some populations within that category that are excelling academically, and there are other populations within that category that are really struggling.
Yep.
And those groups have said, we get forgotten, right? because Asians in general are doing so well, we are not getting our needs met. So I think that ability to show that like, hey, on average, this group might be doing okay, but that does not mean that everybody in that group is doing okay is really important.
Yep. And so that's another reason to kind of aim for it. But I think one of the things that I kind of realized back to the original kind of pushback from the client was that like they prefer charts. They prefer a chart like this because it has a kind of compact story.
Yep.
But you can tell this same story in a way that that doesn't detract from the original story of like there are significant differences kind of between the groups, but also with enough context that your brain is less likely to jump to these kind of like bad blaming habits.
Yeah.
And so there's the trade-off of like we need to oversimplify it for reach is a false trade-off. You can tell that same story in a way that is more complete and more truthful.
Yeah. Malasal made a comment here, and this is a really good point. She says, my question would be, are all groups given the same resources and or access to the same things to succeed equally? The same numbers are similar in New York. And I think she's referring to the educational data. And I would push back and say, well, some of these groups are not getting the resources to meet their needs. So I don't care if they're the same, right?
And I think so. That's one of the considerations that we want people to kind of think about when they see charts like this is instead of just immediately jumping to kind of like blaming the groups, to think through like, well, what are the external attributions that may be that may be the cause of this? Is it resourcing? Is it more structural? Like there are so many different things in a person's environment that dictate it much more than kind of any personal thing.
Language, access,
Yep.
Is it location? Is it right? All of these things.
And I think that's one of the other kind of big takeaways for stuff like this is you can help by trying to break things down and show more of the diversity of outcomes within a group, but also prompting people ahead of time or showing this in line with other plausible explanations that they may not be likely to kind of get to on their own. So having this in the context of writing or just listing out like other kind of external reasons that this is the case, I think is the ideal way to kind of communicate data like this.
Yeah. And I think that's the takeaway, but we're not done here, right? I certainly don't want anybody to come away thinking like, oh, this is how to present data, or that this is a how-to. I think that we've just raised a whole lot of questions here and additional things for people to think about when they're presenting data. Absolutely.
Because like I said, the chart that we showed on the right is better, but it doesn't solve the problem entirely. And so there's certainly still more work to do here.
Yeah. So I'm gonna share some resources in the chat. First are some links to follow Eli on Twitter and Medium. There we go. And then I also want to help people find an article that the Urban Institute wrote on, oops. That's one of the reasons we usually have more people doing this show is because it's a lot. There we go. I'm gonna have to post the Twitter and Medium links again. But I want people to be able to find that Urban Institute article on doing no harm.
Do no harm guide is that's actually how I found you. John Schwabish and Alice Fang did great work on that. They talked about your post directly, and it's there's so many other considerations for how to visualize this type of data, and they cover a lot of them that are outside of this kind of blame issue that I've been exploring, but that are also super important to think through. Yeah. I mean, I think that's really the thing is, we are creating our data visualizations in the context of, we've just all been taught, we're used to seeing things a certain way, right? We do what everybody else has done. Audiences are used to reading it a certain way. But there's a moment here in the context of, we're thinking about equity in a lot of things
and people have demonstrated a willingness to work a little bit harder right now at this moment in history. So I think now is the time to say, like, how can we even take data visualization and make sure that we are using it to advance the work that we want to do, right? And not just fall into some of those traps that we have over and over.
That's right.
Yeah. So so Eli and I have been working on a blog post that summarizes some of these reasons why this is important. That will be coming out soon, and you'll see it on all our social media channels. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a fantastic show.
Absolutely.
And have a great weekend, everybody.